we're going to go ahead and change now to a 3-thread serger stitch. Because this is a 4-3 2-thread serger, what happens is this: I can use 4 threads to create a stitch, or a seam like we did with our 4-thread safety. I can use 3 threads and create some different stitches, or I can use 2 threads instead of just the standard 1 thread and a bobbin. So to change that, I'm going to go ahead and cut one of the needle threads because I need to have my looper threads in place. So I'm going to cut that, and it's a good idea to remove your spool after you've cut your thread, or at least wind it up so it doesn't tangle in any of the other threads. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and run my thread out so that that thread comes out of the needle. And that's just simply press your foot down and let that run. Then you just thread off until the thread is out of your needle, and then make sure that your needles are in the highest position. You're going to use the little tool that came with your machine, which is a small Allen wrench, and you're going to remove the right needle. The 3-thread stitch does 2 types of stitches, a wide and a narrow. If we left the right needle in, it would be a narrow stitch, but with the left needle we're going to do a wide 3-thread. So we're just going to remove the needle and set it aside. And we can set it aside inside the case so we don't lose it. Okay, now we are set up for a 3-thread overlock, and what the 3-thread overlock is used for is stretchy knits like lingerie, tricot, dancewear, and it does a phenomenal job with stretching, but it can also be used for a decorative stitch. Let's look at what it does first, and then we're going to look at how to adjust the tensions if we need to. You should also have a balanced stitch on this. And if we have a balanced stitch, our threads are going to meet in a specific way, which is going to give us the maximum stretch needed for tricot or lycra. And this is your balanced 3-thread. It just wraps over the edge, and you can see that the balance is perfect because we're lining up with the lower looper thread and the upper looper thread on the top edge of the seam. And what this does when you open it up is it does form a seam line, but it gives you the maximum stretch out of any of these overlock stitches. Balancing your 3-thread is going to be very, very simple. It's going to be the same as your 4-thread. If you notice looper thread pulling over to the front, then you know you need to adjust the tension on your lower looper. If you notice thread pulling to the back, then you know that you need to adjust your tension on your upper looper. Let me show you what those look like when the tensions are a little bit out of whack. Okay, this is going to be what your stitches would look like if your lower looper tension was incorrect. You would need to tighten the lower looper to get that to meet on the edge. And that's just simply tightening your looper tension and redoing the stitch. If your other looper, your upper looper, is incorrect, what you end up with is the opposite problem, and you would just adjust your upper looper then. The balanced 3-thread is a very basic stitch, but it becomes a much more interesting stitch when you start using some decorative threads. So we're going to put decorative thread in our loopers, and we'll leave just our standard thread in the needle. But the decorative thread that we're going to use is a rayon floss and a polyester floss. You can also use your heavy cottons, and you can get a very neat effect on a receiving blanket. You can use this for a blanket stitch. You can do a lot of different things with this stitch and decorative thread. But let's start with a balanced decorative edge, and then we'll move on to our blanket stitch. We threaded up with some decorative thread, and I'm going to show you what this nice little 3-thread can do with the balanced stitch. We have our decorative thread in the lower looper and in the upper looper, and we just have our standard thread in our needle. I'm going to go ahead and begin sewing, and I have a little heavier thread. So, I should probably catch that tail and make sure that the tail is out of the way as I sew. But this gives a nice, heavy, finished edge to something like a baby blanket or the edge of a seam, the edge of a zipper. You could do a lot of different things with this stitch, and you can see it gives a nice balanced stitch. And because I put 2 colors of threads in, it's actually a 2-tone stitch. And that is the wide 3-thread stitch, and it's just an overlock stitch. It'll still give me a little bit of stretch, but not quite as much with this decorative thread. Now there are other stitches that we can do with the 3-thread that require basically just moving the thread around a little bit and adjusting our tension. One of them is a blanket stitch. And you can do the blanket stitch with a decorative thread like this, or with some of the heavier cotton threads that are out on the market. You can even do this with a silk ribbon if it's narrow enough and get a very unique effect. We're ready to start our first project. We have the machine threaded with the decorative thread, and we're going to do one thing before we start looking at how to complete the project, and that is test stitch. Because there are 2 types of sewers. There are the ones that test stitch and the ones that say oops a lot and use their stitch ripper. We're going to begin test stitching, and for this we're going to make sure that we have the wrong sides of our fabric together. The other thing that we need to think about is where these decorative threads and these colors are going to be placed. This is my upper looper. It's going to show up on top. This is the lower looper. It will show up on the bottom. So if I want the contrasting green on this blue fabric, I need to make sure that the blue fabric is facing up. So let's go ahead and test stitch, make sure that our stitch width is good, our cutting width, our stitch length, and that we have our tension set correctly. And this is what our nice finished stitch looks like. And if you look, we've got a nice balance here with, the 2 decorative threads joining at the top. Our top stitch, or our needle thread, I should say, is nice and balanced here. And this is the front, so we have a nice contrasting color. Okay, now our test stitch is good, but there's something else that we have to think about. If you've done any serging, you know that when you begin serging on something like an oval or a square, you run into a little bit of a problem. You end up with something that looks kind of like this, and when you go to end, you end up with something that looks kind of like that. So you have like this little arc going on. Well, we're going to look at how to resolve that problem with a very, very simple technique.